Picture this. You are staring at your index finger, and pinched right on the end of it is one of those $30 glowing plastic pulse oximeters you can just pick up from any drugstore.
Right, flashing that little red number at you.
Exactly. Or, maybe you're watching a medical drama on TV and the doctors are sprinting down a fluorescent hallway shouting things like, "He's going into hypoxia," or "Look at that tachypnea."
Oh, yeah. That classic medical TV panic.
It's everywhere. And usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of, like, mechanical precision. You break your arm, the X-ray shows a jagged white line, and the doctor just points to the film and says, "There's the problem."
Which is a very binary way of looking at human biology. Broken or not broken, we naturally gravitate toward conditions that can be perfectly categorized.
But the moment you step into the world of human breathing and gas exchange, that expectation of clean precision just completely goes out the window.
It really does. It becomes this incredibly complex and historically quite murky landscape.
Which is exactly why today we are going on a deep dive to decode the 3 core building blocks of medical vocabulary that govern how we understand human respiration.
We're talking about oxy for oxygen, capno for carbon dioxide, and apnea, which describes the physical act of breathing itself.
And we are not just doing a dry terminology lesson here. These specific root words hold the secrets to 200-year-old scientific rivalries.
Yeah, and they explain human survival at the literal summit of Mount Everest. Not to mention, they expose some pretty significant hidden flaws in the medical tech we rely on every single day.
It's wild. By the end of this deep dive, you are going to realize that the word oxygen is actually just a fossilized, centuries-old typo.
I love that story. It's quite the historical drama.
It really is. But before we get to the historical gossip, we need to establish the linguistic rules of engagement here. We all kind of know the standard medical prefixes, right? Tachy for fast, brady for slow, hyper for too much.
Right, and hypo for too little. But it's how they attach to the suffixes that dictates whether we're talking about the blood, the tissue, or the physical act of breathing.
Because medical terminology is fiercely compositional. It's like playing with Lego blocks.
Exactly. The root tells you the target. So
Yeah.
oxy for oxygen, capno for carbon dioxide, and then the suffix dictates the state of being.
So emia always refers to blood levels, and emia refers to tissue levels, right?
Spot on. But the emia family is unique because it attaches directly to those prefixes to describe the mechanical act. Eupnea is normal breathing, apnea is absent breathing, tachypnea is fast, bradypnea is slow.
And the fascinating part about that emia family is how, I guess, malleable the underlying concepts have proven to be over time.
Oh, absolutely. The word dyspnea, for example, uses the prefix dys for difficult or painful breathing. The word itself hasn't changed in centuries.
But how modern medicine actually understands it has completely flipped, hasn't it?
It's a totally different paradigm now. For most of the 20th century, doctors treated dyspnea as an objective mechanical problem. Something to be solved with tests and charts.
So they'd measure it.
Yeah, they would diagnose it by looking at your respiratory rate, drawing a blood gas measurement, or observing the accessory muscles in your chest to see how hard you were actually working to pull in air.
But then something shifted.
Right. In 2012, the American Thoracic Society published this landmark official statement that fundamentally redefined dyspnea. They declared it a subjective experience of breathing discomfort.
Meaning it's based on what the patient feels.
Exactly. They explicitly modeled it on how modern medicine understands pain. Pain is whatever the patient says it is, regardless of what the lab work shows.
That is such a huge shift. So we used to treat dyspnea like an engine diagnostic test, plugging in the sensors and reading the exhaust output to see if the engine was struggling.
A completely objective mechanical assessment.
But now it's more like the check engine light. If the driver says the light is flashing, well, it's flashing. Even if the mechanic can't find a physical problem under the hood.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And this reframing altered the entire approach to pulmonary care. Because you can have a patient reporting agonizing dyspnea, but their blood oxygen saturation is a perfect 99%.
Wow. So the numbers look great, but they feel terrible.
Right. Or conversely, you can have a patient with horrifyingly abnormal blood gases who reports absolutely zero breathing discomfort. The root words stayed exactly the same, but the clinical focus shifted entirely to the patient's internal experience.
That malleability, in how we define a struggle to breathe, it really reveals just how ancient and layered these words are. I mean, they didn't just fall out of a modern medical textbook fully formed.
Oh, not at all. They carry centuries of baggage. The suffix apnea comes directly from ancient Greek. The verb nein means to breathe, and the noun neue means breath or wind.
So people have been using these terms for a very long time.
Thousands of years. Writers in antiquity, like Hippocrates and Galen, were already using compounds like orthopnoia, which we now call orthopnea.
That's the condition where a patient has to sit strictly upright just to breathe, right?
Exactly. And they were using that term thousands of years before 19th century medical lexicographers actually systematized the terminology.
And the root for carbon dioxide, capsnodo, has a much more visual, almost poetic origin story. It comes from the Greek word kapnos.
Which translates to smoke.
Smoke! I love that.
Yeah, it's very evocative. Carbon dioxide itself was actually first clearly identified as distinct gas by a Scottish physician and chemist named Joseph Black back in 1754.
But he didn't call it carbon dioxide, did he?
No, he initially called it fixed air because he observed it could be fixed into a solid form like a carbonate or released from it during chemical reactions.
But the clinical root capno gained prominence because physicians drew this visual and etymological link between combustion fumes and exhaled breath.
Right. A fire consumes air and breathes out smoke. A human consumes air and breathes out carbon dioxide.
It's such an intuitive comparison, but the crazy thing is, the technology that actually made this root common in hospitals' capnography, the continuous measurement of exhaled carbon dioxide, that didn't become a routine standard until the 1980s.
Yeah, it took a long time. For decades, the smoke of our breath was conceptually understood, but it was rarely measured in real time.
Which brings us to the most famous root of the three, oxi. You mentioned earlier that the very word we use for this life-sustaining gas is fundamentally incorrect.
It is entirely wrong based on chemistry. Antoine Lavoisier, the renowned French chemist, named the element in the late 1770s. He formalized it in his 1789 textbook.
And he built it from Greek roots too, right?
He did. He used the Greek oxys, meaning sharp or acid, and kides, meaning producer or former. So oxygen literally translates to acid former.
Acid former, because Lavoisier genuinely believed that oxygen was the essential universal ingredient that made all acids acidic.
He was completely convinced. He built his entire chemical framework around that idea. He coined the term as a direct attack against the phlogiston theory.
Right, phlogiston. That was the prevailing belief that a fire-like element was released during combustion.
Exactly. Lavoisier proved that combustion was actually a reaction with his newly discovered gas. And he just assumed this same gas was the magical building block of all acidity. It was a massive, aggressive paradigm shift in the chemical revolution.
But there is a huge problem with his theory. Muriatic acid doesn't contain any oxygen.
None at all.
Yeah.
We call it hydrochloric acid today, and its formula is just hydrogen and chlorine. So Lavoisier staked his entire linguistic claim on the wrong element.
He just gets wrong.
He did. And Humphrey Davy, an English chemist, proved exactly that in the 1810s. Davy demonstrated that hydrogen, not oxygen, is the real general acid-forming principle.
But by the time Davy figured that out, it was too late.
Way too late. By the time Davy published his findings and corrected the chemical record, the word oxygen was already so deeply entrenched in international scientific literature that changing it was impossible.
That is just wild. Every single time we say oxygen, we are literally carrying around a fossil of a disproven 18th century scientific theory.
We are. Lavoisier got the fundamental chemistry of oxygen wrong. But what's really striking is that we are still getting the biology of these gases wrong today.
Oh, absolutely. The general public just assumes that a lack of oxygen is what tells the human body to take a breath. Like, you run low on O2, you gasp for air.
And that is arguably the biggest misconception in basic physiology. People treat carbon dioxide like it is purely a toxic waste gas, something the body just needs to vent into the atmosphere.
When in reality, it's doing a lot more than that.
In reality, carbon dioxide is the primary chemical signal that controls your entire respiratory drive.
Wait, really? So the body isn't monitoring how much oxygen it has left, it's monitoring how much CO2 has built up.
In a healthy person, CO2 runs the entire show. You have these specialized sensors in your brainstem called central chemoreceptors, and they are constantly monitoring the pH levels in your cerebrospinal fluid.
Okay, so how does the CO2 play into the pH levels?
Well, when carbon dioxide builds up in your blood, it crosses the blood-brain barrier into that fluid. It mixes with water to create carbonic acid, which makes the fluid slightly more acidic.
And the brain detects that.
Instantly.
Yeah.
Your brainstem senses that tiny drop in pH and fires off an urgent signal to your diaphragm saying, take a breath right now.
So if breathing is an orchestra, oxygen isn't the conductor setting the tempo. carbon dioxide is.
Yes, oxygen is just a backup conductor. Your body does have peripheral chemoreceptors in your neck and aorta that sense oxygen, but they only kick in as an emergency override if your oxygen levels drop dangerously low.
Oh, wow. So most of the time, our breathing rate is basically just a really sophisticated carbon dioxide management system.
That is exactly what it is, and that dynamic explains the clinical folklore surrounding the hypoxic drive.
Right. I wanted to ask about this. You see this in textbooks all the time. The warning is that patients with severe chronic lung disease, like COPD, have retained so much CO2 for so long that their brainstem sensors have essentially gone numb to it.
That's the classical teaching, yes. So they supposedly breathe primarily in response to low oxygen.
And the old hospital lore says if you give a COPD patient too much supplemental oxygen, you turn off their drive to breathe and they just stop breathing.
Which modern pulmonology has shown to be a really dangerous oversimplification. I mean, the clinical observation is real. If you put certain COPD patients on high-flow oxygen, they will sometimes retain dangerous amounts of CO2, which can lead to respiratory failure.
But it's not just because the oxygen flipped a switch in their brain.
Not at all. The mechanism involves complex physiological domino effects. Primarily, it's about ventilation-perfusion mismatch and something called the Haldane effect.
Okay, let's break those down. How does giving someone oxygen actually worsen their carbon dioxide clearance? Let's start with the mismatch.
Sure. So consider the ventilation-perfusion mismatch. In a damaged lung, the body is actually really smart. It naturally constricts blood vessels around the most diseased, poorly ventilated areas of the lung.
Because it wants to send blood to the good part.
Exactly. It redirects the blood flow to the healthier areas where gas exchange is still working. But if you suddenly flood the entire lung with highly concentrated supplemental oxygen, those constricted vessels dilate.
Oh, I see.
Blood rushes back into the damaged areas of the lung, the areas that are terrible at clearing out carbon dioxide.
So the oxygen essentially tricks the lung into sending traffic down a broken highway.
That is a perfect way to visualize it. And the second major factor is the Haldane effect, which happens down at the molecular level.
This involves the hemoglobin, right?
Right. Hemoglobin molecules in your blood carry both oxygen and carbon dioxide. When you flood the blood with oxygen, that oxygen aggressively binds to the hemoglobin.
And that causes a problem for the CO2.
Yes, because this binding physically changes the shape of the hemoglobin molecule, an allosteric shift, and that drastically lowers its affinity for carbon dioxide.
So it literally kicks the carbon dioxide out of the transport vehicle.
It forces the CO2 off the hemoglobin and dumps it directly into the blood plasma, which rapidly spikes the patient's blood CO2 levels.
Wow. So the danger of supplemental oxygen in these patients isn't just about suppressing their breathing reflex. It is about completely reversing the body's delicate internal gas routing systems.
Exactly, which proves why root word precision is so critical here. We conflate these concepts constantly. Hypoxia and hypoxemia sound nearly identical, but they describe entirely different failures in that routing system.
Right, let's clarify that, because they are used interchangeably all the time.
They are, but they shouldn't be. Hypoxemia with the alien suffix means low oxygen specifically in the arterial blood. Hypoxia with the iria suffix means low oxygen at the tissue level inside the actual cell.
And you can totally suffer from one without the other.
Absolutely.
So, if hypoxemia is a supply issue in the blood and hypoxia is a utilization issue in the tissue, hypothetically, if a toxin like cyanide blocked the cells from actually using oxygen, your blood monitors would say you're perfectly fine, even while your tissues are suffocating.
That is brilliant, because cyanide poisoning is the classic teaching example for this exact distinction. Cyanide binds to an enzyme in the mitochondria of your cells, which completely halts cellular respiration.
So the cells just can't take the oxygen in.
Right. If you draw arterial blood from a cyanide patient, their hypoxemia status might be totally normal. The blood is completely saturated with oxygen, but the cells are entirely locked out of using it.
Leading to fatal tissue hypoxia, just cellular suffocation.
Exactly. And, if we take this delicate balance between oxygen, carbon dioxide, and our breathing rate and push it to the absolute environmental extreme, we end up looking at high-altitude physiology.
Mount Everest.
Yes, Mount Everest. In 1981, a physiologist named John B. West led the American Medical Research Expedition to Everest, known as AMRE.
And they were doing actual medical research up there.
Oh, yeah. Their ultimate goal was to collect alveolar gas samples from climbers standing on the absolute summit of Everest, breathing ambient air without any supplemental oxygen.
Which is insane. At the summit, the barometric pressure is roughly a third of what it is at sea level. The air is incredibly thin.
To survive that lack of pressure, the human body has to engage in a massive physiological trade-off. Normally, at sea level, your arterial carbon dioxide runs at a partial pressure of about 40 millimeters of mercury.
Okay, 40 is normal.
But at the summit, these climbers were surviving by hyperventilating to an astonishing degree. They were breathing so fast and so deeply to capture whatever sparse oxygen was available that they were constantly blowing off their carbon dioxide.
Wait, so what did their CO2 drop to?
Their measured CO2 dropped into the single digits.
Single digits, from 40.
Yes. To fight off the lack of one gas oxygen, their bodies willingly sacrificed their normal baseline of the other gas, carbon dioxide, simply by drastically altering their breathing rate.
So they basically hacked their own physiology. It is the ultimate real-world illustration of our three root words interacting to keep a human alive.
It really is. You have severe tachypnea, fast breathing, driving, extreme hypoxia, dangerously low blood, CO2, all acting as a desperate defense mechanism to stave off fatal hypoxia.
Three distinct physiological events happening simultaneously in the same body. But, we don't just see this extreme manipulation of gases on mountaintops. It happens in the intensive care unit at sea level every single day.
That's very true. The Everest climbers willingly sacrifice their normal carbon dioxide levels to survive. And in the ICU, doctors have learned to do the exact same thing, but kind of in reverse, through a practice called permissive hypercapnia.
Permissive hypercapnia, meaning they allow the CO2 to run high on purpose.
Exactly. See, for decades, if a patient with failing lungs was put on a mechanical ventilator, the clinical instinct was to force their blood gases to look normal at any cost.
Just chase the perfect numbers.
Right. Doctors would program the ventilator to deliver these large breath volumes, large tidal volumes, to aggressively push oxygen in and flush carbon dioxide out.
They treated abnormal numbers as the enemy, but forcing large volumes of air into already damaged, inflamed lungs, that has to cause incredible physical stress.
It does. It causes a phenomenon known as volutrauma or barotrauma. By forcing large breaths just to normalize the CO2, the ventilator was literally overstretching the delicate alveoli in the lungs.
Getting overinflating fragile balloons until they pop.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
This sheer mechanical stress triggers a massive inflammatory cascade in the lung tissue, and that inflammation can spill over into the bloodstream and cause multi-organ failure. The treatment itself was killing people.
That is tragic. So how did they finally change that approach?
It changed in the year 2000 with the ARGS-NET trial, which was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. The researchers tested patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome, and they proved that if you use much smaller tidal volumes to protect the fragile lung architecture from that stretching trauma, survival rates improved dramatically.
Even if those smaller breaths mean the ventilator isn't clearing out enough carbon dioxide.
Exactly. The trial proved that purposely tolerating that elevated carbon dioxide hypercapnia was a vastly superior strategy to destroying the lungs with mechanical force.
Wow. Do we know how much it helped?
By utilizing smaller protective breaths, mortality dropped from nearly 40% down to 31%.
That is a huge drop.
It was a revolution. Medicine fundamentally shifted from treating carbon dioxide as this immediate toxic enemy to viewing it as a completely acceptable trade-off for tissue preservation.
And this physiological trade-off, this constant seesaw between the three elements, proves exactly why modern medical technology has to measure these parameters independently. Relying on just an oxygen monitor can be a fatal blind spot.
Which brings capnography back into the spotlight. In 1986, the American Society of Anesthesiologists actually made continuous exhaled carbon dioxide measurement mandatory during general anesthesia.
And the clinical logic there is pretty straightforward.
Incredibly straightforward. Imagine a physician is placing a breathing tube, but the tube accidentally goes down the patient's esophagus into the stomach, instead of down the trachea into the lungs.
Which happens. But if the patient is already sedated, how long until the oxygen monitor actually catches the mistake?
That's the scary part. A pulse oximeter might not register a drop in oxygen saturation for a minute or longer because there's still residual oxygen circulating in the patient's bloodstream from before they were sedated.
A whole minute of no air going into the lungs, and the monitor says they're fine.
Right. But the capnography trace, it flatlines instantly because stomachs do not produce and exhale carbon dioxide.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
That one monitoring upgrade, focusing entirely on the capno route instead of the oxi route, is credited as one of the most effective safety interventions in modern anesthesia.
And the same blind spot applies to procedural sedation, doesn't it? there is this concept of the opioid mask.
Yes, the opioid mask. This is huge. Patients are given an opioid for pain or sedation, which powerfully suppresses their brainstem's drive to breathe. They develop opioid-induced respiratory depression.
But as a precaution, the clinic gives them supplemental oxygen through a little nasal cannula.
And that supplemental oxygen acts as a mask. It keeps their pulse oximeter reading a perfect 100%. So the oxygen monitor suggests everything is perfectly fine.
But they aren't breathing enough to clear the CO2.
Exactly. Because the opioid has drastically slowed their breathing, rate-inducing bradypnea, or even periods of apnea, they are quietly accumulating lethal levels of carbon dioxide in their blood.
And the oxygen monitor is totally blind to it.
The oxygen monitor tells the clinician absolutely nothing about the patient's actual ventilation. This is why capnography is increasingly utilized in procedural sedation now. The two monitors catch completely different mechanisms of failure.
It's wild. But, we cannot talk about the limitations of pulse oximeters without addressing their most glaring systemic flaw. During the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, people were told to buy these devices for their homes to monitor for silent hypoxia.
Right, everyone was buying them. But the devices themselves have an inherent optical bias.
In 2020, there was this critical study published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Studing and colleagues, and they demonstrated that pulse oximeters miss dangerously low oxygen levels, a condition called occult hypoxemia, approximately 3 times more often in Black patients compared to white patients.
3 times more often. It's staggering.
Because the underlying physics of the device relies on shining specific wavelengths of light through the skin to measure the color of the hemoglobin, and it was primarily calibrated on lighter skin tones.
Exactly. Melanin absorbs light in the same spectrum that the oximeter uses to calculate oxygen saturation. So this pigmentation interference causes the device to artificially inflate the reading.
So a Black patient could look at their home monitor, see a safe 95% oxygen saturation, and think they're fine.
While their true arterial oxygen was dangerously low.
That optical flaw delayed life-saving interventions, triage, and medication for countless patients, just because the parameter the entire medical system trusted was fundamentally miscalibrated.
It heavily impacted home monitoring protocols. It actually forced the FDA to drastically update their guidance on the technology's clinical limitations. It serves as a really stark reminder that these foundational concepts, oxy, capno, and mecne, they are not just abstract vocabulary words.
No, they are the actual parameters by which we design the diagnostic machines that dictate patient care. We have covered a massive amount of physiological ground today. Let's do a fast recap of the critical takeaways for you listening at home.
Let's do it.
Number 1, gas levels are not the same as breathing rate. Oxygen is not carbon dioxide, and neither of them represents the mechanical act of respiration. Number 2, hypoxia is not hypoxemia. Your tissues can be suffocating while your blood is fully saturated with oxygen.
Spot on.
Number 3, hypercapnia refers strictly to elevated carbon dioxide, not oxygen. And finally, number 4, carbon dioxide, not a lack of oxygen, is the primary chemical signal driving your need to take a breath.
That's a perfect summary. And, to leave you with one final fascinating mechanical phenomenon to consider, look up Ching-Stokes respiration.
Oh, this is a wild one.
It was described by John Chan in 1818 and William Stokes in 1854. This is a distinct breathing pattern often observed in patients with severe heart failure or specific neurological injuries.
It is essentially a real-time cycle of different Ching states.
The patient's breathing literally waxes and wanes. The breaths grow progressively deeper and faster, hyperpnea and tachypnea, and then they gradually become slower and shallower, ultimately culminating in a period of complete apnea, where breathing stops entirely for a stretch before the cycle forcefully restarts.
It operates like a broken thermostat in a house, where the system is constantly overshooting the target temperature and then completely shutting down.
That's exactly it. The brainstem's delicate chemoreceptors lose their precise calibration. The body becomes trapped in a continuous physiological loop, wildly overcorrecting between the ancient ghost of Lavoisier's oxygen and the smoke of carbon dioxide, just totally unable to find equilibrium.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you take a moment to think a little differently about the invisible mechanics keeping you alive the next time you take a deep breath, or, the next time you see that little red light glowing on your fingertip. See you next time.